Hello and welcome to We Are the Deluge. We are your hosts, Emily Crandall and John McMahon, charismatic megafauna. This is a spoiler-free chapter-by-chapter podcast about the climate change novel The Deluge by Stephen Markley. Today we are discussing the phase transitions of methane hydrates, set in 2013, the first chapter from Tony Petrus's point of view, which we are presenting in the form of an academic journal article. John, do you want to explain why?
So as you may have heard on the prologue episode, which has definitely already been recorded, is that we're going to approach the 6 point of views in this novel through a structural conceit that will engage the same elements every single episode, but will reorganize them and frame them relevant to each character. So Tony, the academic character, gets an academic journal article. When we get to Jackie, she'll have a pitch deck. We'll do a pitch deck because she's the advertising hotshot, and so on and so forth. So Emily and I are as excited as you are, audience, to see whether or not this structural concept works or not.
And just probably, as many of you can guess, we know a little less about pitch decks than we do about academic journals. So.
Right. So we get to start in a place that's comfortable-ish for us.
And bear with us.
Please.
I'm excited.
Me too. I also would have gone with a charismatic megafauna if you had put me on the spot. So I support that. Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Should we dig in?
Yeah. Let's begin with the abstract, is all academic journal articles do. Emily, what's your one sentence summary?
Okay. My one sentence summary is: Tony contemplates the relationship between science and politics as terror over the looming threat of climate change and the death of his wife descend.
Oh, I love that. I've got stock middle-aged white male academic, oceanographer Tony Petrus, ponders family, the public state of science, and the foreboding phase transitions of methane hydrates as he receives an anthrax hoax letter.
Nice.
Yeah. Surprise, we both hit on what is the political and public relationship to science, almost like that's an important part of the whole novel. And it's set up from within a couple pages of this.
Yeah, I was getting so many dissertation triggers just in the first chapter.
Probably you way more so than me. Luckily enough, I could avoid that whole thing.
Yeah, I'm sure we talk about that in the prologue episode.
Absolutely. No doubt.
Okay, so one thing we're going to also keep track of as we move through this book is keeping a running list of who the characters are and how they're related to each other, because as you'll see as we go along, there are many, many, many characters in this book. So Tony is the main character in his chapters, but also his family are recurring characters. His wife, Gail, dies in the first chapter. She gets diagnosed with cancer at a young age. We don't know exactly how young, but the kids seem to be school-age kids.
Yes,
in 2013.
Pre-college,
Yeah. And then they have two daughters together, Holly, who he calls the older one, and Catherine, who he calls Khaleesi. And so that's his, the most of his family unit. Gail also has a stepbrother.
Corey.
Adoptive brother. Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. And do they specify that she's a black woman, or do they call her a woman of color? Okay. Yeah. And he's a white dude.
Like a Fox News dude.
Yeah.
Corey, the brother. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But they're still siblings and they stay close.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Corey's still very much in Tony and Gail and the kid's life.
R.I.P. Gail. I mean, we could talk about, killing the mom right at the start.
I suspect we will. We also have on our character list for this week, we have FBI Special Agent Chen, who we meet here early on. He's the major responder, the named character among the FBI responders to this hoax anthrax letter that turns out to be cornmeal that Tony gets mailed from an anonymous address in Kentucky. And then
with a fun spelling error as well.
Right. Which of course he remarks upon, which is the most obnoxious academic shit that I could see myself also doing possible.
Yeah.
And we have his collaborator, co-author, co-researcher, Nico. And they had a grad student advisee or a kind of collaborator, or I think it was postdoc actually, relationship, and now seem to be mostly equals, although Tony, of course, has his annoyances with Nico, as he does with everyone he encounters throughout the 900 page of this book.
Wow. Did we miss anybody?
No.
Okay, so there's the anthrax plot is kind of like the center, the anchor, I would say, of this. It's almost like his kind of meditations on life and his own sort of role in it, but it's all mediated through this moment that sort of activates something in Tony that then kind of haunts him throughout the rest of the book. So he's seeing at the same time also some data, right? At the same time as he's opening this envelope that's fake anthrax. And he's like, that juxtaposition of those two experiences is sort of like where his fear kind of like congeals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Real science and technology studies, Emily, there, right?
Well,
the extremely active anthrax letter, which I suspect we might get into shortly. Should we head to the intro of this podcast academic journal article?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. So we're going to do cultural artifacts in the intro because every academic article you need a good hook, hypothetically, good in extreme scare quotes. So I'm going to pitch to you, Emily, that the appropriate pair for this chapter is Zadie Smith's novel On Beauty.
Okay.
And I mean, this is a little bit like obvious choice, right? Because it's another novel in which a character, if not the central character, although it's kind of the central character of Smith's novel, is the kind of grumpy, white, late middle-aged academic married to a younger Black woman who is experiencing academic malaise and who is like constantly interacting with kids who will both surprise and challenge the father, right? And I think that there's a way in which Tony is an interesting choice to start as the first chapter because he's kind of like a conventional fictional protagonist in some ways, right? The prickly middle-aged white male academic. There's like billions of books about. I want to say them, but like I'm approaching that territory, so I might have to say us or proto us. I'm a bit younger than Tony, but not that much younger than Tony, right? So there are all these books about us or them, and I think that Zadie Smith's On Beauty is a pair for this one. She's well, I think that Markley is quite like critical and not particularly rosy about Tony, with a couple exceptions. But Zadie Smith's examination of Howard, who is the protagonist of that novel, is a bit more critical than Markley is of Tony.
Well, right. So in that sense, maybe a really necessary pair. That's really interesting because I love Zadie Smith and I've actually not read On Beauty. I think it's the only book of hers I haven't read.
Yeah.
And it's funny that that's the one that has like a prickly academic as one of the main characters.
Yeah. I love this book. I read it maybe like 3 or 4 years ago. It's one of my favorite books I've read in the past many years.
I think she's such a really interesting writer of white guys, like in White Teeth, right? She has that whole first part of the book that's about the guys who went to war, right? And you're like, why is this young woman writing like a classic 20th century war novel? But like she gets something else out of it, right? Than like
absolutely
the guys who went.
It's like classic standpoint stuff, you know, like if you actually need you need the you need the consciousness that is forced to be in a multiple position with regards to like some dominant stream or identity or motive power in order to like actually get a more critical and clear view of that.
And you have thread the needle for that hook perfectly. What a beautiful transition into our lit review.
Yes, but before we do that, I want to hear what your introduction is.
Mine is sillier.
Great.
I was like, there's a lot of pop culture in this one little chapter. It's like 10 pages long. It's quite short.
Yes.
But they mention a lot of different things that they're like watching. And at one point, Tony's sort of lamenting on how like the right woman can sort of rescue you from the morons of the world. And his like illustration for why she's so cool is that she was just this sort of like effortless, she's a brilliant woman, but she does things like walk around wearing a Lando Calrissian shirt, you know? And I realized that in the new Solo Star Wars movie that where Donald Glover plays Lando Calrissian, that Emilia Clarke is in that movie. Khaleesi, Mother of Dragons.
Oh my gosh. Look at these connective tissues that Emily is drawing out here.
So it's a pop culture angle. I haven't really fleshed out the stakes of the politics yet, but
do you want me to make an attempt to do so?
Yes, I would love that.
So I think there's like, because the Han Solo of Solo is Star Wars story, which like I'm on team hot take. Solo is actually kind of good. But Han Solo in that movie is portrayed as kind of doofy. And I think that like that's the transformation then that Solo has to go from Alden Aaron, right, playing him, to Harrison Ford playing him, is a transition away from that like central like goofy like kind of broy but like aloof. And
okay, so like, this chapter where Tony is like experiencing this terror and the loss of his wife is the shedding of his old like young Solo self.
Yes, and then the question remains to be seen about whether he ever is as like effortlessly cool and sexy as Harrison Ford playing. So
well, stay tuned for cryptic foreshadowing.
So you said, Emily, that somehow I set up your lit review. So let's head there. In lit review, we'll talk about Emily and I are political theorists, as you definitely heard in the prologue. And so we're always going to try to connect some of what we're reading in Stephen Markley to some of the things we are reading or have read in our academic lives.
Yeah. So I was thinking in this piece actually about a piece that I use as the sort of backbone for one of my dissertation chapters, which, as you'll probably have heard in the prologue
Yeah,
episode, was very
definitely, for
related to
sure.
this book. So this Elizabeth Lloyd, she wrote a book about the science of the female orgasm in like looking through all people who are evolutionary biologists are like obsessed with finding like an evolutionary function for the female orgasm, even though all the evidence suggests that there isn't one, or if it is, it's not like other sex characteristics that have a specific evolutionary purposes, like male orgasms, for example,
Sure.
right? And so her whole book is really interesting because she looks at like these, like how scientists see in the data what they want to see that confirms, right, that the male and female are analogs to one another. And she has this other essay that she wrote like in the 80s where she takes apart philosophers of science for their critiques of feminist philosophers of science. So feminist philosophers, these like old school white guys, like the Tonys, right, of
Yeah.
the philosophy of science world, accuse feminist philosophy of science of being anti-scientific. And so she looks at when they say that feminists are being anti-scientific, exactly what it is that they're accusing feminists of, and then looks at how they get it all completely wrong. And the sort of paradox that the feminists that they are most accusing of being anti-science are the ones who are most interested in actually recuperating science or sort of like saving science from its own masculine bias, right? So like, how do we make science the project that lets us like describe, give better, more accurate, more sophisticated descriptions of the world? How do we make it less masculine, right? And so like, so that essay is called Science and Anti-Science, Objectivity and Its Real Enemies. And the philosophers of science of sort of, again, somewhat paradoxically being enemies of real science. But I think what Tony is doing in this chapter is really wrestling with like how science as a practice and as a, like even arguably a geographic space, right? The lab, like how it relates to everything else, right? And he has all these moments where he says like, I hate politics. I despise the fact that the scientists who have cute like subjects get more money, right? Like that's where the charismatic megafauna comes from too, right? The dolphins, we can get all this grants for sophisticated sonar just to measure their clicks. But like the work that I'm doing, right, Tony, me, is like actually going to tell us something, right? And they have this conversation, he and Nico, at one point where they talk about the difference between like the corporation wants to know how much we can withstand and the scientist wants to know how long do we have, right?
Exactly.
Like, but I think Tony's not quite getting there yet, but those are the stakes of those two questions are political stakes.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. And he wants to say, I despise politics. What I'm doing is not politics. But then this moment happens, right? And now he's like confronting his own work, right? As in a different way. And I think what I anticipate is being set up here is actually a reconfiguring of that boundary. And like this idea that things that happen sort of outside the formal like halls of science matter for science, right? Matter for what we can say about the world and what the truths that we can come to agree upon and like why that matters, right? Why does it matter that the methane hydrates are going to explode, right? Like it doesn't just matter because we might all die. It matters because we're making bad decisions, right? So I just thought that like that framing that Lloyd has in that piece about the sort of irony that people who are like science is this like rigorous thing are actually impeding some of sciences, right? If we can talk about science as a
multiple practice,
or like a pronoun, right? Like that science, they're actually making science harder to do, right? In a way. So I think I see Tony kind of like wrestling with that a little bit in this chapter.
Yeah, that's brilliant. And I love the kind of positioning of Tony as like at a threshold space in his own relationship to science, because as you point out, there are some ways in which he is in fact like opening up or questioning like what the boundaries of science and science in public or for public might mean, right? Like he's an oceanographer who like is studying climate change, right? And like obviously there are, I'm sure, plenty of oceanographers in our world studying things that are directly or indirectly connected to climate change, because what isn't at this point, right? But still, that kind of like positioning of the oceanographer in Tony's like journey through different kinds of science, right? Like that he starts out as a theoretical physicist and then finds his way to oceanography, is I think kind of telling of the way he's willing to play with the boundaries that science like sets up and scientists and scientific practices set up to like cordon off or create some kind of like different zones within. But at the same time, he's subject, as you point out, to this like very harsh, there is science and there is politics, and like they're not meshing at all.
And I think there's even a little bit of an irony that like in his own narration, right? Like he's this sort of like one moment that anchors the whole chapter, right? We get his past and a little bit of his future in that moment, because he's like sort of walking us through where his mind goes when he's doing science, right? So there's this like, he's like portrays the sort of monotony or the mundane part of his job as like deeply human, right? He's like looking, how do I make the data make sense? And like the only way he can sort of like take a step back enough to sort of see the bigger picture is to let himself kind of float through his memories of his children and to hold on to these like affective bonds that he has with other people, and that those are like tactics that he uses to like set himself up for the realizations, right? The enlightenment clicks, the ahas, right? And that like he's narrating it as a deeply human, connective, relational activity, even at the same time as he's saying science is objective and rigorous.
Yes.
And like that tension, I think, is like so critical, because if you ask a scientist what they do, and I was even thinking like Thomas Kuhn here, right? They're like, we make discoveries, right? Science discovers things. We ascertain truth about the world. But they would also probably tell you that in their day-to-day, like, it's pretty boring. They're just like falsifying, hypotheses all day long, or like verifying the same data that they've been working on for 15 years, right? Like my friends who are lab scientists are like, it's like, we're not really doing science in this like grand scheme, right? Like most science is normal science, not revolutionary discovery science.
Yes.
And so I think we're seeing him grapple with both the lofty sense of purpose and his work, and also the mundane, like really human side of it. And those are like, he's like one person in all of those iterations, right? Or like one subject, or I don't know if we want to get into postmodern accounts of the subject yet.
That's for when we get to book 2. We'll save that. I appreciate he becomes one human who does all of that, because it kind of belies that like masculinist, reason, progress driven notion of science is linear, or some sort of linear, refined, restrained, rational at the exclusion of like all other supposed parts of the self that are cut off from rationality. Because and this is also working on the level of Stephen Markley writing this book. And, like, I think what you just said is a case on behalf of having people in the humanities writing about or doing indirectly science of a sort, because we get that kind of different sense of self or subjecthood. But it's like through the reminiscing about teaching the kids about extinctions and the funny nickname that they give them, that not only do we get like the science that Tony is doing and how the methane hydrates, clathorates, like, and kind of their unsheathing, like contributing to and accelerating climate change very rapidly. But there's also way much like that is entering the reader into the like, here is methane hydrates 101 and why it matters on this literally like geologic time scale as well. So like there's how the reader is positioned in relationship to Tony's sense of science and actual practice of doing science.
And I think we could talk about how Gail gets used there too.
Yes.
I think she's maybe a little tropey in some ways in this particular chapter, but I think, and like in the service of sort of setting up Tony as a character, which can be a little bit of a problem, but
for sure.
But yeah, it's interesting. I think that's a bold way to do a scientist right off the bat, is to like really portray the hubris, right? Like
the hubris and the fallibility at the same time. And like you said, the kind of mundanity of that that's always intermeshed with all the other parts of his life.
What other theorists do we want to enter into our lit review?
I think I will add, thinking about the mundanity in particular of academia and kind of Tony's struggle for funding, is that I couldn't help not thinking about Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos, which is this book from 2013-14 about neoliberalism and the kind of transition of practices, ways of thought, ways of understanding the self that increasingly come to be defined by logics of the market. And there's this ongoing bit in this chapter, right, that starts with the characteristic megafauna, but then continues into what you pointed out about what do the petro companies want out of science, and what do the scientists want out of science, and what may be public or politically meaningful with regards to science. And the fact that that's all encased within the struggle for funding, right? And that it's about Tony and Nico trying to find the appropriate funding mechanisms to continue their project, which doesn't have any obvious market utility to it. unless it's the petro companies counting what the quantity of methane hydrates are throughout the oceans of the world, right? And Tony makes the point that, well, actually his and Nico's research is probably antithetical to what the petro companies want to get out of methane hydrates, right? That they want to wrap those into petrochemical like market mechanisms and stuff and extract energy from them. And it's all kind of got me thinking about the way that Wendy Brown's chapter on academia and higher education, like with a focus on the University of California system in that book, discusses not only, say, the ongoing attack on the humanities or kind of quote unquote like less useful majors and careers or majors and fields of study and so on and so forth, but also the way that she wraps that into a story about shifts in funding of higher education and academia and the way that an increasing reliance on private funding and oftentimes industry or defense funding, right, distorts what academia might be otherwise.
Yeah.
And so there's a way in which like I think that offers a kind of situates Tony's like very character driven, mundane day-to-day life of the scientist narrative in this kind of broader scope or scale of developments within academia over the 21st century.
Yeah. Well, and science as an institution, right? It has like, you know, it has these different pillars. It has the scholarly pillar and the like industry pillar, right? And like in what ways are those like dependent on each other or sort of, I think that's really interesting to think about it in those terms too, because one of the things that Gail does again is she's the sort of like voice of reason, right? Telling him about like, it doesn't matter if this data that you have is like super groundbreaking and it's going to change our understanding of the future of the world. If you can't talk about it in a way that people can understand, they're not going to fund you, right? So it's not even just like you don't have a product that you can market. It's like you can't explain it to, you know, and he has all these like sort of quips about non-scientists or laypersons, right? Like if the layperson can't understand it, then your work doesn't matter, which is like an interesting way to think about like some of the sort of demands of neoliberalism on people who are nodes of institutions like that, right? The making knowledge that like, if you can't say why your knowledge that you've made matters for somebody who's fundraising for the board, you know, then like, have you made any knowledge?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I definitely have, you know, I think it's easy to imagine out the scenarios of like, well, what is Tony's department like or whatever research center he's a part of? How do their kind of internal politics affect the science that he does or doesn't do?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh God, internal politics. I don't even remember if we get any of those dynamics in his chapters, but that would maybe be too much. I don't know if I would have enjoyed the book as much if that was part of it.
So I have like a perverse desire to read academia novels, including those that like get into the bullshit of institutional politics and stuff as some sort of like self-flagellation mechanism. It's not great. It's not what you want.
Are there a lot of them?
Yeah. And there's like a little bit of a resurgence of them in certain ways, which I find interesting, right? Like I'm thinking about like this novel of Vladimir that came out maybe like early 2023, late 2022, which is very much that, like obviously on beauty. So it's part of
Interesting. Yeah. More cultural artifacts.
Yes. Yes. All right. Should we head into our methods and findings?
Let's do it. Yeah.
All right. I think it's maybe worth spending a tiny bit of time thinking about so the first words we read in this book, right, are that this is book one last chance. And then we get this first paragraph of the whole novel or the first words of the whole novel. So phase transition methane hydrates 2013. One of the grad assistants had left the mail in a pile by the lab's primary computer. The first envelope Tony Petrus opened was a confirmation letter from the American Geophysical Union for an appearance at the annual AGU conference to present initial research findings. The second envelope would change the way Tony felt about the world. He never got around to the rest of the day's mail. So like, Emily, what does that opening set of words, right, kind of like set one up to expect in this novel, right? Because like, I think one of the things we'll probably pay attention to is, given that this novel is so form self-conscious and forward, right, with all of the different formal things that Markley is doing, it's probably worth doing some like form content work on our behalf. So like, how do you think that is working or not working as an opening paragraph for the 900-ish pages to come?
I mean, it again, I think juxtaposes like the dread with the boring, right? we're going to this conference, present our findings, and then, but we're also having this like earth shattering, right? Like change in this literal how one views the world, right? So it's like I think setting up a question maybe about what that threshold is, which I think, something that comes up. We both teach environmental political theory often, and it's like a question that philosophers, ethicists, political scientists, and theorists are obsessed with, right? Like, why do people not care more about climate change? And it's like, it has a lot to do, there are a lot of hypotheses about the scope and scale of the problem being like sort of too hard to grasp, right?
Yeah.
Or that like, if there's not, cute, charismatic megafauna that are like dying out, that you don't feel an emotional connection to things like methane hydrates, right? And so like, what is it? What actually is effective at kind of flipping that switch is something that I thought he's maybe like teasing or setting up here, right? That like what precipitates these moments where your entire view of the world shifts sort of like irrevocably, right?
And how might like what is banal or seemingly boring itself, phase transition into methane to, into something profound or transformative or earth shadowing or whatever like fancy word one wants to use. Because I think that like that juxtaposition, which you so like thoughtfully brought out in terms of like feminist science studies about the mundanity of what Tony is doing and going through, and you could slot his thoughts on a bunch of other things that are not climate change. And yet it's like his reminiscences and the banality of his academic life that like launches this 900-page climate novel that I think is telling about maybe what Markley is himself attempting to do with the novel, right? Like the novel is, and there's some interviews where I think he's directly or indirectly said that this is such a gigantic problem. And like, we can think about all the different ways, as you said, why there might be, less response than we would want or need or would expect or however bring that. And like this novel is an attempt to think through that differently or challenge people differently. Well, and the fact that that's happening in Tony's like this interruption in his day-to-day life. Yeah. Although it's the reverse, right? Because here it's like this thing happens and interrupts this transformative climate change research. So there's also like the reversal of it, I think. Cool.
Yeah, well, he's what phase is he transitioning into?
Oh, I've got a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but well, actually, I do know because we talked about it. But when I read this book, the first time I read it, I read the entire thing in 1 week. It was in the summer, so between semesters, and I texted literally every single person I know who cares about politics, who cares about climate change, who is like tangentially related to academia. And I was like, you have to read this book. I know it's 900 pages long, but like it clicks so much stuff that clicks that people don't always see as kind of part of the same problem. Exactly. And I think that like that click, that all of these things are actually deeply interconnected, is part of this moment, right? Like this envelope is going to change the way I feel about the world. And I'm never opening the rest of that mail. Like, yeah. But he's like, come with me, won't you, dear reader? Like, it's bold and it's like really ballsy.
It is. I mean, and look, you sent that text and I was on one of those texts, and here we are like a year and a half later being like, we're going to make a 35 episode podcast about it. Yes.
Yeah. The painstaking detail, chapter by chapter. Yeah.
So you raised the question of like, what is the phase transition of Tony himself? And I do like this idea of phase transitions as a kind of overall analogy for Tony in this chapter because of the anthrax hoax letter being such a transformative moment, because of Gail's death as a transformative moment for him, because of what the Monte Carlo simulation that he and Nico are running on methane hydrates is also such a transformative situation. But there's something about like the phase transitions that is, I think, crucial to understanding like what a reader might do and also what the characters might do with or in this novel, right? Because like there's also, this is against the background of Tony has both the theoretical background and theoretical imagination, and he has the quote unquote hard sciences as well. And it's like, well, maybe those are the things you need to read this book or to undergo your own phase transition with regard to climate change.
Or like, we all need our Gail. Yeah, I think I thought it was funny when they do the Lost bit, which, he's talking about, this is a little anticipating some of our
Same.
some of our footnotes section, but
yeah, exactly.
They're like, oh, they're watching Lost, and she's like, Gail says, it offends me as a reader of literature, but like, you may not watch an episode without me, right? It's just like, okay, we're all contradictions, right? And like full of things that aren't consistent, right? And inconsistencies, that's the word I was looking for. Yeah, I think I like that the opening paragraph is sort of an invitation too, right? Like, I don't know, it almost dares you to like not read the rest of the mail or something. Sort of quite literally.
To not read the rest of the mail, and maybe like to not read the rest of the book. Like, I don't know. I can also see, a reader being like, I got this book, it's 900 pages, and it started with 2 sentences about the American Geophysical Union. Are you kidding me?
Yeah.
Like, I could see that as well. And maybe this is the thing one doesn't get to.
Right. Well, yeah. And then like to juxtapose his discussion of the science with his children being like annoyed for talking about boring stuff. He's like, I'm getting tanned at the beach with my babies, and all I'm thinking about are the hydrates bubbling at the bottom of the ocean. It's like, I think it's maybe intentionally daunting in that way, but in pointing out that maybe tension, right, between Tony's like scientific life and his like family life, right, is like not maybe like a sort of peace offering, right, to the reader. Like, yeah, this guy's gonna talk shit about lay people who can't understand science, but he also loves his kids, right, and like
he does,
yeah, and he's gonna have to reckon with that tension, right, and the fact that nobody cares about methane hydrates. Nobody knows what they are, right?
Including we, the reader, right? Yeah. And like, this is a difficult...
The clot rates, are those real? I forgot to look that up.
I did. So when I taught this novel, like I did read a couple like journal articles about the like hydrates, what Tony calls the quote maddening mystery of methane hydrate phase transitions, end quote. And like I skimmed a couple of journal articles, and my extremely vague, extremely limited sense of what's happening is that Tony's work in this novel takes a thing that scientists are concerned is happening, but like rapidly accelerates the time scale on which it happens, right? So this becomes like
real.
I feel okay saying this, and even though we're spoiler free, that like the methane hydrates kind of function as the in-universe exploration for warming that I get the sense is slightly more rapid, or maybe much more rapid than the kind of like median projection of our like
current
quote unquote reality.
Yeah.
Right. So I think there's like a little bit of scientific background, and then there's also, this is the kind of science fiction-y part of it, that it's just happening a little more fast, and a little more intensive.
Should we read the paragraph where he explains what it is?
Please do.
This starts on page 4. So he says, bacterial degradation. This is also happening while he's picking up the fake anthrax envelope,
which is just incredible.
Yeah. Bacterial degradation of organic matter in the oceans produced methane. And then he had once told his dad this, a math professor who doesn't care about physical nature, right? Just another funny like dig. Basically, plants and animals that rotted in a low oxygen environment became trapped in crystals of frozen water. It took thousands of years for methanogenic bacteria and sediment to do their work and to trap the molecules where the conditions of temperature and pressure were right, either in the Arctic permafrost beneath the seafloor or on its surface, clutching the rock in frozen chunks. Every gas hydrate has a similar structure, but methane was the most prolific prisoner, and in some places, it was a prominent feature of deep sea ecosystems, which is what first drove the interest. So like the worry, right, is that as the oceans warm, these ice crystals are melting and releasing an insane amount of methane that's trapped under the ocean. So ostensibly contributing to further like ocean rise and warming, but also contributing to general methane release in the air, right?
Right. And this is the caution that, or the fear that Tony brings up, right? That like this creates a really, really terrible feedback loop, right? Because the methane hydrates like unfreeze, quote unquote, to be unscientific about it, because of rapid warming, right? Like 2 to 3 degrees Celsius, which we are well on our way to. And then the release of the methane and the methane hydrates warms things more in a more accelerated fashion.
Yeah.
And that like, this is where we get into the extinctions, right? He says, twice the hydrates melt and twice you have catastrophic extinction, right? So these are the stakes stakes of the novel. And so I'm also, so okay, maybe you're reading this and are like, why am I learning about like the intricate, boring details of this like 40-something white academic's life?
Mm-hmm.
But there's also like these hooks on the reader. Like we're talking about extinction. We have this like fake anthrax hoax letter, which is a kind of more like conventional thriller sort of element in this part of the novel. And I think that this is a kind of way to like maybe wrap in and set up some of the stakes of the novel.
Yeah, like if you care about big extinction events, then you should care about methane hydrates and their phase transitions. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too because that is immediately followed by a discussion of when hydrates have been in the news, why they have been, and what journalists have gotten wrong, which is really interesting too because it's a huge thing in EPT, right? This like problem of how the data gets communicated to laypersons, and this happens sort of in like there are critiques in sort of two directions in our scholarly literature, right? That like on the one hand, sometimes people over dramatize the data, and so then people say, well, they got it wrong, right? They predicted this in 5 years, and it's only this, or it's different. It's more than what they predicted, but they still didn't get the prediction right. And so it's like people don't understand, I think, what the relationship between observations and predictions is, or something. And so like over confidence in the what's to come sometimes does the work of undermining the like credibility of the person, or in the opposite direction it happens, right? Like that the data aren't portrayed dramatically enough, right? That the scope of the problem is sort of pared down because it's all probability, right? And so and he talks about that like it being a problem of what the audience can grasp, but also it being a problem of just wrong information being published. And so like and it gets put to service for other things, right? Now people are like, oh, there's this whole 1,000-year supply of natural gas under the ocean, let's make money off of it, rather than like, if we do not stop warming this ocean, we're going to enter into a next massive extinction event, right? And that like that's what journalists have, that's where they've been bad here. They need a timeout.
Yeah. And this is, I think, effective also character work for Tony, right? Because from his perspective, no one gets it right. Like the industry is wrong, politics is useless, the media gets it wrong, lay people are incapable of understanding it, like all of his point of view, because there's the persnickety crotchety element of Tony that is somewhat core to his being. And it's interacting with these broader ideas that like we can bring, or Markley is bringing to the novel about like, well, what does it mean to communicate publicly about climate change or about science?
Yeah. Which I think, if I remember correctly, is maybe a little bit of cryptic foreshadowing, right?
Yes. Yes, for sure.
What are some other things that jumped out here? I mean, should we talk about the sort of the Gail of it all?
Yes, please. What?
I mean, I always cringe a little bit at the plot device of using the dead mother as either as a character device for the kids or for the husband. And it is interesting that she starts to, well, the way the chapter is written is really interesting because it's in the moment, right? It takes place at the moment of the anthrax hoax, but it goes back and forth even in the timeline, but like all sort of woven through his own like mediations. And then it gets a little more abstract kind of as the chapter gets toward the end in terms of like where we are in time. But Gail it's almost like she was always dead from the beginning. I thought on this reread, I didn't catch that the first time, but she sort of always appears as a like mythical figure who's perfect and who like made everything okay and who's now no longer there. And so we're floundering without her, right? That like she was the one who knew how to communicate science, what his research was to people who don't care about methane hydrates, right? And she was the one who was always there with a joke to sort of ease the tension or the pain
and
or whatever.
Knock him off his pedestal too, right? That he sets himself on, even as he also has like self-abnegating tendency.
Yeah, like she when he gets the anthrax, he imagines her telling him a joke to alleviate the stress, but she doesn't actually do that, right? It's like his projection of her, right? He imagines her saying something like, oh, well, it's a nice break from all those bras and panties you usually get mailed, right? And like to sort of cut him down a little bit. But I think I hadn't noticed that on the last read, and it was really striking to me in this chapter. I don't really know what to make of it, or if it's just sort of like a problem of a dude writing another dude, but
I think that's a part of it. Like, I suspect, especially in Jackie chapters, we'll address that dude writing dudes and dudes writing women situation. But there's also, and this I'm going to cryptically foreshadow, is that I think a question like a first time or second or third time reader can always ask themselves is, when is the chapter we're reading being written or thought? And that like that's a sneakily complicated question in this novel. And so like I think that that's maybe playing into it too, in part because of the like multiple time perspectives that happen in the course of this chapter. But yeah, I mean there's an element of, you know, like the trope of the kind of like magical Black person who is like is closer to people and like provides a sense of perspective that is necessary to a white protagonist. And
always knows what to say, how to both cut them down and make them feel a little less guilty. Yeah,
exactly. That's being written here. And, you know, I mean, this is a question I suspect we can talk about if we want at various points throughout the novel, is how conscious or not is Stephen Markley himself, like aware of some of the tropes that are being used in the novel? Is it like a thing that he is somewhat in control of? Or is it a thing that he is just kind of falling into in the way that, like, you know, he and I are white men of a very similar age, like can easily fall into, even if maybe we're trying to not do so. So I think that's kind of open question. But yeah, I mean that Gail gets like killed off in the first chapter is also another classical, like, okay, we use this Black character to prop up or support a white character. And then we'll have like Tony's two biracial children, right? Which, and the fact that they're biracial kids, particularly in Holly's like storyline, I think will be something.
Yeah. What else? I have a lot of notes about the way that he talks about science, which is just like, I think all related to my kind of lit review theory framing thing. But it's interesting that he talks about something that I think people who are not like hard scientists don't really understand about science, which is that, right? And this is back to maybe some of the Thomas Kuhn stuff, but like, okay, we're trying to find patterns, right? And explain phenomena and come up with formulas that will work to explain more phenomena that are related to those initial things, right? But also, like, one of the things that scientists are looking for are for things that we can't predict, for randomness, right? For irregularity, for math that doesn't add up, right? And that, like, these are all also kind of like puzzles. And so I thought that was a really cool framing device in this chapter too, right? He talks a lot about things that we can't explain and like how our explanations for stuff that do explain some things, there's these data points that they can't capture. And like, why does that matter, right? And like, that's not just like an accident or something. And so like what we need to do is to try to explain the things that we don't have an explanation for. And like this thing that nobody cares about is actually the best explanation.
Yes, that kind of irony and that's built into the kind of foundation of this novel is, I think, quite fascinating, in part because, you know, for reasons you just identified, the modeling aspect or projection aspect of science is so central, and also not just science, or I'm thinking here of some of the simulations that Ashir will run. Is so central to this novel. And you're right that like that's a little bit less standard of a way to write a scientist in a work of fiction, right? Like the scientist in a work of fiction is, I think, more often like, if they're not like a computer genius, and Tony has some elements of that, like he and Nico are running this Monte Carlo model, then they're like doing experiments and they're in their lab and they're mixing chemicals, or they're like, experimenting on this and that. And like even Tony remarks in this chapter that they're in this repurposed lab space when all they have are computers and files, right? Like that's it, right? They're not like, they don't have methane hydrates like in a, terrarium, in some fancy setup.
I wish they did.
Yeah, I know. They don't have the money to do it. And so you're right that like it is a different kind of science. I think it speaks also to the, to the structural thing you pointed out, to the Elizabeth Lloyd of it all, and the kind of like threshold, like questioning, but falling into standard conventions of science that Tony's falling into here.
Anything else jump out at you?
I think the only other thing, and then I know you've got one more, Emily, is the anthrax hoax, because it's this extremely dramatic event that like is its own phase transition in the novel and in Tony's life. There's kind of like a before he receives this letter and after he receives this letter that is at the same time the part where the math's not mathing and the methane hydrates have to do that. And it's like a little bit potentially of a kind of like shattering of this this like insular bubble. And he comments that like, okay, he knows that climate adjacent or climate scientists get like, threats or whatever all the time, but that this is something qualitatively different, right? This is a new, rapid, intense level of it for him. And also that he deals with it like through humor and is like terrified, but also like somewhat denying that this is happening. And, then even Agent Chen, right, does a little bit of joking about it too.
Yeah.
So just the fact that like we have this extremely dramatic event that is both the centerpiece, but also kind of buried.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, right, Gail starts calling him anthrax.
Right.
He starts getting more death threats, but not, they're mostly just emails, right? So the sort of like materiality of the envelope and the cornmeal as they find out, like cornmeal starch or something. Is it relevant that he knows that they never found the guy? I don't know if that, well, we'll just flag it in case it is.
Yeah, I think it could be built into a theory that I would not actually believe.
Okay. I was also curious about, I don't remember if in 2013 people were still worried about anthrax. And it strikes me that he, in the novel, Tony, right, is like trying to remember Common Sense from 2001, right? Yeah. And like, is there something significant about in 2013 sort of like making a callback to anthrax? And like, or is that supposed to be like an analog between the moment, like the political moment of 2001 and like the political moment of 2013? Or I don't know if that's a stretch to say that like he's drawing a parallel between like war on terror and like this era of like climate acceleration. But
it's a stretch, but it's one that I love a lot. A few months ago, I was listening to a podcast about like how fucked up the FBI investigation of the anthrax letters was.
Oh, interesting.
And so like that, I was probably listening to that like as I was teaching this chapter actually, and starting so back in like February. But yeah, I think the playing with time, right? Like what time periods are analogous? Like how do we shift from 2013? Like so, the first book of this novel like takes place before its publication. Then the rest of it's all projection forward into the near future. And I think that your point about like anthrax being a hazy memory, but a memory nonetheless.
Interesting. We'll have to see what other historical parallels and analogs we can draw there.
So many.
So my last big thing is, I think, the juxtaposition of, on the one hand, the first paragraph, and on the other hand, the last paragraph. That so this is in the narration where he's like really jumping around, right? And he says he'd feel that same eclipsing terror born on the day of the letter in the same familiar way, and all he could see were the bubbles, and then beyond into the molecule itself. This invaluable atomic combination in a prison of ice, struggling its eternal life away in a tomb until it broke free and began its journey through the depths and onto the invisible wastes at the crown of the world. Like, just went full on poem, like long form poem in this last paragraph, which is just a fascinating, and it like it builds really subtly, and then all of a sudden you're in this like very lyric, prosaic paragraph, and you didn't notice the transition, but at the end I was like, whoa, like I thought it was a really fascinating experience to move to like find yourself in that prose and not realize that that's where you were going. I don't know. What did you think about that?
It's a decent analog to climate change, right? Like you don't realize, right? It's hard to perceive on a day-to-day or week-to-week or month-to-month or year-to-year, right? Kind of sense of like the intensification or the ramping up. And then it's like you're there and you're like, we're fucked, right? And then here it's this paragraph that starts off that, okay, he's reminiscing about his child. And now we're talking about the invisible wastes at the crown of the world, which is a good phrase.
So
like,
great.
Props to Markley there for sure.
Yeah.
And so, there's that kind of that subtle ramping up or intensification that you only realize that you've done when you get to the is portentous with regards to climate change itself.
Yeah. And I was thinking about like that also maybe as a meta commentary on the navigating the relationship of the scientist to like the rest of the world, right? That he sort of starts in the technical and he ends in the poetic. And it's like that's, as a man, right, how he's making sense of his terror, right? Not through the numbers or even the structure of the molecule itself, but this like imagery of the molecule, like frozen but on the precipice of exploding, right? And like that's the thing that, I don't know, that anchors his terror for him is, I think, really interesting.
With a kind of true scientific note, and that there's like this kind of reverence for or celebration of the methane hydrates as well, right? Like they are in a prison of ice, and then they become the subject, right? Struggling its eternal life away in a tomb until it broke free and began its journey through the depths, right? That the kind of activity, the agential nature of the methane hydrates themselves, like, is part of this lyrical turn.
Well, and it's destructive, but it's awesome, right?
Yes.
And so, like,
exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it's really beautiful.
Yeah. One thing that, I mean, I told my students this, and we can tell our listeners this as well, that like, pay attention to these last paragraphs of chapters. I think Emily and I both have theories about that, which I guess we can say now, or we can wait until a later date about like why he's doing these dramatic lyrical final paragraphs all the time.
Yeah, I need a little more refresher before my theories get some shape.
Perfect.
But
all right, I think we made some great academic discoveries here.
So many methods and findings.
Buckle in, listeners. All right, we of course head on to our footnotes. So maybe they're endnotes at this point. Who can tell? One of my takes about the novel The Deluge by Stephen Markley is that it's a very funny novel, in that but it's often a kind of tragic, like gallows humor or something like that. And I think that there's some extent of that in this chapter, but I think this is a funny book. But I also think this is a funny book that is pitched towards like bougie millennials and Tony's chapter academics. But what did you find funny about this chapter?
I found two things, actually several things funny. But I already flagged the Gail noting that loss is offensive as a reader of literature to her. And I was wondering, like, okay, so everyone who I know who liked Lost was a political scientist. And in part, I think, just for the cheesy reasons, like Locke and Hobbes, right? And like
Locke and Rousseau,
like watching their like political theories sort of play out in real time in this like controlled experiment, right? Like literally the state of nature. And it's like dorky, funny, cheesy for that reason. But I think it's funny that doesn't carry over, right? Like she's a academic too, and she's a literature person, right? And I think it's interesting that like sort of nerdy interest in Lost doesn't translate from political science into literature. I was like very amused by that.
That was at the top of my list as well. I still maintain there's an article to be written, perhaps by us, about Locke, Rousseau, and Lost, and Locke and Rousseau dudes.
I mean, that sounds really fun. I can't believe that hasn't been written yet. By the way,
it maybe has, but like if so, I'm unaware of it. Get in touch, I guess.
Yeah, so I guess I will give Markley, like, in spite of the trope of like killing the wife right away, killing the mom. I did find her funny. Like the things that Tony finds charming and amusing in her, I also find charming and amusing. I love the joke she makes about having to withdraw the girls from ExxonMobil Little Tots Academy. It was like so spot on, and like Wendy Brown very much haunting that joke.
Definitely.
And then the other one that was really, really got me was that Holly learns the term gender essentialist as a little kid and goes around calling everything gender essentialist. But the list of things
she's not wrong.
She's not wrong. The list of things she calls gender essentialists are TV commercials, children's shows, movies, all sports, and everything her Uncle Corey has ever said. Which, like,
damn, no lies.
What? Spot the lie. Like, she's right, and it's hilarious. I know. Whenever I teach, anything in women and gender studies classes, and we're talking about education and like, learning gender performance, all my students are like, oh, everything I ever watched as a kid, now I'm seeing differently. And I'm like, yeah, because that's where you learn gender essentialism.
Yeah, exactly.
Holly's right. The older one is right.
She sure is. I did love that bit as well. I would add into the footnotes like the general academic malaise that Tony feels. Some of those jokes like relevant to us, some of them not so relevant. Like you and I are not particularly going to be grant funded in our academic lives, right? But like academic writing is boring and tedious. The life of an academic is much more mundane than you might expect, or maybe expect. That I have trouble communicating my ideas to anyone that doesn't speak the like language of theory or whatever is all true, and I find it amusing. The fact that Catherine's nickname is Khaleesi is hilarious for reasons, some of which we can't disclose for cryptic foreshadowing reasons. But this also generally, Tony's love for Game of Thrones is a funny thing about him.
Yeah.
And very on.
Yeah.
It makes me laugh every time a Game of Thrones reference happens.
Yeah, I forgot how obsessed everyone that we knew was with Game of Thrones. Like even faculty, like old school faculty in our departments. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lost parallel there as well.
I just caught a funny part and to your point about the academic malaise humor that has to do with the moment you were saying that their lab used to be a real lab and now it's just a computer lab. But he says the cabinet that once held equipment now stored files. The countertops that might have held aquariums of marine specimens now provided a home to mountains of paper flotsam. Like what a savage like minimization of what it is that people with computers and papers do. Just like it's a pile of garbage.
With an aquatic metaphor thrown in for good measure.
Oh, I love it. I think that's all the footnotes I have.
That's what I've got for footnotes.
Beautiful. Should we reveal our title proposals?
Yes, our dramatic conclusion.
Yes.
Emily, what's yours?
Okay, mine is Methane Hypochondria, the scientist's paranoid transition.
Oh, I love that. I think that's probably better than mine.
Injected a little psychoanalysis in there.
We need it. Yeah. Tony needs it also. I've got distracted, ominous foreboding, unlikely climate warriors, and the phase transitions of methane hydrates.
Ooh, that's good. That's probably more accurate. I went a little more like loose. I think loose interpretation.
I mean, I think yours is better, but for like maybe 7 people will listen to this. Maybe we go with the less loose one. Although I think like we rope them in and then we turn to the psychoanalysis.
Yeah, great.
Yeah, hit him with that in like book 3.
We'll get there, folks. Yeah,
absolutely.
Beautiful. I mean, I vote for yours for that reason.
I'll accept.
Great.
That will not always be the case, but I will accept in this one instance. Up next, we've got the first Shane chapter entitled Shane and Murdoch Get Breakfast, set up in 2014, which we'll be podcasting about as a political manifesto.
Beautiful. So excited for that.
Yeah. So thank you for joining us on We Are the Deluge.
And we are the Deluge.
Yes.
Yeah.